Hey there, everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be continuing on in my exploration of the complete Crepa. This is Volume 4, Private Life. And so far, this is by far my favorite of the volumes. This is definitely the one I would recommend to people who are looking for. I've had people say, hey, if I only bought one, which one should I buy? Having browsed through the 8 that are out so far, this and not having read 5, 6, 7, 8, but just on a browse, I think this is probably the best one if you're only going to get one, or if you want to try one to dip your toes in. This is probably the least pornographic of them all, and I think the most kind of formally playful, it looks like, based on all the other ones I've seen, and has a good span of Crepa's art from early on to later in life, going from the 60s to the 80s. This one I'm probably going to talk about a lot because, like I said, this is a really formally playful book, and I enjoyed that. Also, just the fact that the stories are a little more grounded in the characters' lives is interesting to me. I will say, compared to some of the other ones, the psychological aspects are a little bit downplayed, which is interesting since they're heading into their private life. But let's take a look. I've got a lot of notes in here, so this will probably be a longer video. Like with most of Crepa's work as they're presented in here, it looks like he went back and would add two stories or give them preludes and things like that, so it's made it hard for Fantagraphics to arrange these completely chronologically. The more I'm reading through these books, the more I'm torn on. I still really want to read it all chronologically, but I get why they've grouped things in the way they have, and they've grouped them in such a way where I think you've got the most important information about the characters up front, and then the quieter stories like these that just have references to other things, you've kind of got everything you need to understand them. So I do believe, now that I've been reading more, that at least the order that they've chosen has been very well curated, even though I'm still tempted to want to read them chronologically. So this first story, the story of Valentina in here, is actually 1976, and it's a prelude to the next story in the book, which is done much earlier. You're also having Valentina here reading the Murders in the Rue de Morgue, which in the previous volume, in volume 3, we see that Crepa has done a adaptation of that and two other stories from that character. So it's interesting that he's tying in his adaptations of literary work to what he's doing with Valentina. And in this story, you're basically having her have a dream or a nightmare that she is the victim in the story that she has just finished reading. So she's the woman that gets, captured by the orangutan and put up the chimney there. This story ends with Valentina saying, I better get dressed. Leo's going to be here. And she puts on this flowered dress. So remember, this is in 1976. The next story, The Lesmo Curve, starts with Valentina being picked up, and this is done in 1965. It starts with Valentina being picked up in that dress and taken somewhere by a guy named Leo. When the story doesn't start, but Valentina is introduced that way. So in 1976, he's doing a prelude to a story that was written and drawn in 1965. This is, I believe, a pretty early pre-Valentina story that was more focused on Philip Rembrandt, who becomes her lover and husband, baby daddy eventually. He's also, as Philip Rembrandt, he's an art critic, and then at night he is the superhero Neutron who can freeze people with his eyes. In these early stories, you really get a sense of Crepa trying to create a cultured superhero, so he's hanging out with like the hip, cool mod people. They're referencing like here, oh, Alice, that Bridget Riley dress is so gorgeous. I mean, this being done in '65, Bridget Riley would have been, pretty new on the scene. I believe op art would have kind of just becoming popular at that point, if I've got my history right there. And, mentioning Bridget Riley would have been really like you're up on what's going on and what's really cool. So I think that's a big part of the appeal for these early stories to me, is that sense of connection to like the hip and the cool and the artsy fartsy. Also, I just really like Craypaw's early work, with the bigger, thicker spotting of blacks. He's doing a lot of textural stuff that looks like maybe he's coloring with the crayon or doing some dry brush or scraping with the razor or something. This is the stuff that I think it shows a heavy, like it would have influenced Frank Miller as well. So I really just like the look of this early stuff. That's one of the reasons I think this is a good volume, as well as you get these stories from 65 and then you get stuff all the way up to 85, and you can really see how his style developed, and they're pretty drastic differences, as we'll see. This little bit here is cool. I like the infographic nature of it, but it's also showing like what Philip as Neutron can do, where he can like freeze people up, and he can also freeze devices. He can freeze people through the TV. That's how these stories start. Craypaw was intending to do an action adventure series, kind of paying homage to his favorite like comic strip cartoon artists like Alex Raymond and guys like that. You can see some of his interest in sci-fi in these early stories. And then when he introduces Valentina, she kind of obviously just takes over his interest, and that very quickly these stories become about her. Now you get the introduction of Valentina here, and you see that she is being brought by a guy named Leo. She's in that flower dress, and she's being introduced to Phil for the first time. So this, as far as I know, is the introduction of Valentina into the stories, and you can tell really quickly that she takes over Craypaw's interest. Something that bothers me a lot about Craypaw is he'll use arrows throughout to point people through his compositions, and sometimes his compositions, I'll point out a couple, they're absolutely baffling in terms of like your assumption about how a reader's going to follow through. But in this one, I think it's pretty clever because he's couched this arrow into part of the background design. And there's one other page in here where he does that. But then this one, it's looking like maybe it's part of the signage in the background, as is that one. So this really works to me as a compositional trick to make sure that the reader reads like that. But that is a problem throughout the book that we'll take a look at. So skipping to the next story, this is called Ciao Valentina. This is from 1966, and you can see even now, like Valentina's name's in the title, even though there's still kind of these action murder mystery things with Philip Rembrandt involved as a detective. Valentina's become the kind of lead in the story. In this one, since she's a fashion photographer, she has taken these pictures that then people want to steal the film of, and they come to find out that it's because she accidentally captured a murder going on in the building behind the model. So interesting storyline there, but I particularly like this visual trick that Craypaw is doing, where he's got this blow up, he's got this circular, using the magnifying glass to create a circle within the composition, and then he's also having the fan and these other kind of rhythmic repetitions of the circle, breaking up the rhythms of the grid. That's, if you've seen my other Craypaw videos, one of the things that really draws me to his work is his rhythmic breaks up, his subdivisions. Even in something like this, which is a fairly standard, 9-panel grid, within this, he's got all these other subdivisions, breaking it up, making it look like more panels than there really are. And he's very obviously interested in the subdivisions of the building. So to include something other than a rectangle in there, I think is really cool. And it creates just a really, really cool visual. This almost looks like a panel mapped on top. Like I said, really, really playful stuff all throughout. Here's another instance of a really clever arrow actually embedded in the flow of the page. You've got one up here where he's just like telling you got to read this way instead of down this way, because sometimes his work will read down this way and then over, which is a bit annoying. But in then this one, you have the arrow actually as part of the image in the panel, and I think that's quite clever. And I wish he would have explored that more. Those are the only 2 times I've seen that so far in his work. In Ciao Valentina, Craypaw is obviously paying homage to a lot of his favorite cartoonists, his influences. He has the characters go to a comics party, and you'll see that there's a lot of classic comics characters in here, even having like a Charlie Brown character in there. And he has the characters go through and interact with each other, and so you get some compositions where they're looking like, oh, this is an Alex Raymond Flash Gordon thing. You've obviously got the Popeye here. You got Fantomas. Here you've got your Charlie Brown saying good grief. So just a lot of fun stuff like that. That is another one of those things that I think makes this volume the most interesting one, is for people who like enjoy other comics. Obviously, if you're buying this, you enjoy other comics. There's just a lot of little Easter eggs and things like that where you can tell that Crepa is really having fun. From the few little bits I've read of biographical information, he was never really particularly interested in comics. He was more of an illustrator, and his interest in comics does come from the strips more than the books. And so to see him like not having any rules put on what he thinks he can do in his books is really interesting. The next story is called Funny Valentine. This is done in 1967, 68, and 69, and it's obviously a intentional piece of like absurdist, surrealist dream ideas. You can see right out the beginning, Crepa is referencing the Dada movement, so absurdities pre-built into it, and then just playing with kind of Dada composition throughout, where he's got everything all mixed up. So this one's just an excuse for him to have fun with visuals. And again, he's paying tribute to famous artists, and he's showing that his education in the arts isn't just comics. He's very aware of what's going on in the fine art world, like mentioning Bridget Riley. And then here Valentine is saying, good thing I'm using the LHOOQ film. That's obviously a reference to Marcel Duchamp and his influence on the Dada world. For anyone who hasn't taken an art history class, the LHOOQ is a joke that Duchamp put on a painting of the Mona Lisa. He got a print of it, put a mustache, and then signed it at the bottom LHOOQ, which if you read it out loud in French, it sounds like Elle a chaude a cool, which means she has a hot ass. So that syncs up pretty well with obviously Crepa's erotic interest. And then you can still see these very topsy-turvy kind of Dadaist compositions throughout that are really fun. The story itself in this one is nonsensical, but that's obviously his intention in this. That allows him to play with compositions like this, again, the subdivision thing that I really like, where, you know, the order that things are happening in don't matter as much because the story is absurdist in nature. But these kind of panel compositions where you're taking like this unit and comparing it to this unit, but then taking this unit and subdividing it into 4 and 8. Those are very musical things. Crepa references jazz and stuff a lot in his stories as well. And these are the types of things that initially drew me. These spreads like this, these very designy looking spreads, what initially drew me to Crepa's work, and why I bought the books, even though at first I didn't enjoy the stories and not particularly interested in the more grotesque aspects of what he does with the erotica, like having this dead baby here. You know, there's stuff like that I'm not a huge fan of. But these are super influential to me, and something I'm trying to leverage in the work I'm doing right now. Using that kind of composition, that kind of musicality, I think is really, really beautiful. Even within the absurdist dream sequences, the more you know about previous Valentina stories, the more these absurd sequences will make sense. So if you see them as dreams Valentina is having, trying to deal with things that have happened in her past, you'll have references to the subterranean characters. You'll have references to when she goes into Soviet land. You'll have this right here, which is a throwback to a sci-fi piece that he did that Valentina read with her child, and that creates a weird narrative loop in that one. So he's always kind of layering her own mythology of trauma into the absurdity, and that makes it more interesting because it isn't just pure absurdity. It actually has like that psychological aspect where you're in your own mind and you're kind of rummaging through your past. And that's what, as I've really given these a fair read and not just trying to read one or two stories and thinking, this guy can't really write. It's making this into really some really rich, complex work, and I really appreciate that. And like I said, that could be easy to miss out on given the way that the stories are jumbled up, but I think Fantagraphics has curated it in a way that you get the information you need, so that if you do read through it in the order that they've put it in, when you get to a section like this, it would make sense. If you're doing like the which one book should I get, and you get volume 4, some of that stuff might not make sense. And then I would say you'd be buying the book just for the visuals, the delight of what Crepa can do with visuals. There's a reference on this page to Dr. Crepa is out. He's drawing this page, so there starts to get to be some like meta references. And also Valentina is knocking on the door of what I assume is Linus Magazine. And there's some talk about Linus is no place for her. Where are you going to put me? And they're talking about, like, basically I think what was happening is that Crepa maybe was switching magazines. I know in some of the afterward material that I've skimmed through, they mentioned that one of the reasons it's so hard to curate this chronologically is because he would switch around to different magazines and stuff to publish these stories. I also believe there's a chunk in the later half of this book where it seems pretty obvious that Crepa had moved again to another magazine and felt like he needed to catch readers up on what they had been missing out on. And so that's made it hard for them to even tell exactly, what order to put the stories in, even though he's always signing things. Each page has a signature with the date in it. So it is a jumbled up kind of mythology, but the more you get into it, the more interesting it is. Right here you get another reference to this stuff drags me back in every time. These dreams, memories, I want to go back to Linus. So I think this was probably the first story out of Linus, and this is him trying to, in a surreal way, catch people up with a lot of the themes of his work. I also particularly like that he's going in and showing Valentina drawing as a child, and he has, I would guess he probably had one of his kids do this. It's hard to imagine. You're either a really good artist to be able to mimic kids' art that way, or you got to get your kid to do it. So that's kind of fun. And this leads into him setting up being able to go back and explore Valentina's past a little bit, which is interesting as well. So my assumption is that this was a series, because it's happening throughout a number of years. This was probably a series of shorts in a magazine that was getting people caught up on Valentina while he was running some of the new longer stories, potentially. This also ends with this ad. This summer you will find a special Valentina in the newsstands together with Barbarella, etc. So him even putting an ad in there, I think that's kind of funny. He's got ads for some other characters here. I don't know who this Grog character is, but he's obviously got Snoopy there. So being able to do this, like juggle all of these balls at once, I think is really, really interesting and fun. And then even having this as part of the story rather than just an ad tipped in at the end is really fun. And again, showing how kind of just playful Crepa is, especially in his early work. Then we get this story that's from 1968. So that other one, 67, 68, 69. That's why I'm saying I think there were these stories probably running larger stories. And then the funny Valentine was, I would assume, a 1 or 2 page gag that went out the magazine to kind of reintroduce people to the character over a 3-year span. And that's why this one being in 68, which is called Fearless Paper Doll Valentina, this is something that the readers would have read by the time the child Valentina shows up in the funny Valentine one. So again, this really interesting way of like just kind of mixing his work around but still giving people what they need to know. This story shows that Valentina's already prone to fantasy, which is a big part of the character. Like here she's been reading this book, and then as her mom is bathing her, she's kind of having this fantasy situation where she has just seen like this character dunking someone in the inkwell, and so she's imagining herself being dunked in the inkwell, which is also important because there's many times where Crepa breaks the fourth wall and will have himself talking to Valentina. She'll recognize herself as a character, she'll interact with his pen, things like that. So having this early childhood book that he found where it's talking about being dunked in the inkwell, and her having a fantasy about that sets her up for those experiences in her fantasies as well, that he's not actually breaking the fourth wall, that these are just fantasies she's having, maybe. The other thing that's really interesting about this is Crépin's very explicitly acknowledging that part of what he's dealing with in Valentina is his own upbringing as a younger guy in the 60s making his career. He obviously would have grown up during or right after Mussolini and fascist Italy, World War II, and that had to be a big part of his psyche, and that shows up, that idea of like fascism shows up in a lot of work. The other thing that I realized in volume 3, besides dealing with the fascism, is that he's using Valentina as a Mother Mary character, and in this volume she has her child, and so he's using that to deal with what I'm assuming, being Italian, that he grew up in a Catholic upbringing. So that really helped me kind of crack the code of what Crépin is on about in some of what seems like the more nonsensical scenes. If you're just like casually glancing at his work, is actually a pretty deep psychological exploration of the kind of traumas and weights that growing up in a post-fascist, heavily Catholic environment would put you through. We get another story of childhood Valentina in 1969. This is Filippo and Valentina, and it tracks both Philip's story through, the early war era of Italy, as well as Valentina's story. It also includes, sequences of her fantasizing and whatnot. But again, you get this really interesting child drawing here. Then you get the two characters in 1945, Valentina in Venice Lido, and Philip or Filippo in Lydia. Philip eventually gets moved to America, but you can see these two stories playing out next to each other, and you can see how these characters, I think the suggestion is that their similar life experience when they meet actually makes them, more prone to being a couple. Another really formally inventive trick that Crépin uses in this to give the new readers in the new magazine, I'm assuming this is second or third story in the new magazine now, he's giving them the catch up on what's gone on in the story until now, while also rounding out his characters' kind of personal relationships, as he has this game of Philip and Valentina. So a really cool page composition trick, but it also takes them through like what these two characters have been through up to this point, and then now introducing to their baby together. So really, really cool, both visual formal mechanism and a really cool way to tell a story and catch readers up where it's not just a dry piece of text on the front. So really, really enjoy these early stories in here and think they're so smart. And I think this is really the peak of Crépin's work, where you're starting to get some of his more delicate line work, but you still have his rough, chunky, black use of blacks and textures. Valentina the Fearless. This is work done in 1971. Here you see we're going back to December 25th, 1942, and we're showing the birth of, I'm assuming, Valentina and or Philip. Here you have her as a baby, so you're getting, again, more of the backstory of this character. A lot of Valentina's interests, I think, are pretty obviously supposed to be interests that, like, Crépin is showing himself through Valentina. I think this is his most personal work. I haven't read the other stuff, but there's some stuff in volume 3 where there's an interview between Crépin and Valentina, and he's suggesting that this is his most personal work. So you get some really, really nice Alex Raymond, Flash Gordon throwbacks, call-outs here, where he's doing his best Alex Raymond. And you can see how that influenced his style, even though the art doesn't really look anything like it. The interest in line and fashion and elegance that he's picking up from Alex Raymond. I don't know, there's no reference to like the Rip Kirby stuff, but it's pretty hard not to think about Crépin also being privy to that, because of his interest in like the fashion photography and the models, and all of that would have gone really well with what Alex Raymond was doing in that book. You get a lot more of this here, where Valentina obviously likes reading these cartoon strips that have I'm assuming been translated into Italian. I'm assuming these are the things that were available for a young Guido Crepa as well. So you get the Phantom. Valentina's talking here about Mr. Mandrake, so she's reading the Mandrake cartoons. And this is going on throughout her life. Even as she's getting older, she still shows the interest in the cartoons. And it's showing her building this rich inner fantasy life, which is being leveraged then in later books when she has this psychological trauma to deal with. And you're getting these dream sequences or these sequences where she's talking to a therapist and she's in these worlds influenced by these things. He's establishing that, which is really cool. In this story, Valentina the Fearless, Crepa even acknowledges the influence on Valentina's look from the artist Louisa Brooks that he thought was just beautiful. And she's watching this movie Lulu with Louisa Brooks in it, and Valentina goes and cuts her hair to steal the little bob haircut. So he's really using this story to shout out all of his influences, all the things that make up the recipe of the Valentina stories, and then also making that not just influences on the stories themselves, but he's showing that his influences on the stories are her personal touch points as a character. And again, I think that sets up a really interesting thing where when he is breaking the fourth wall, he can do it as like, well, this is just the character's imagination still. So it's like a fake fourth wall break while also being a real fourth wall break. Really, really clever stuff. By the end of these couple of stories that go through 71 and 72 that catch you up on Valentina's life up until now, now you get back to this point where you've followed Valentina and Philip's stories, and they come up to the point where she is putting on the flower dress. And this says, to be continued in the Lesmo Curve. Well, the Lesmo Curve was a 1965 story, and he's putting an ad for it in 1972. So it seems like maybe this story was going to be reprinted within that magazine, or if not, he's at least telling the reader like the next chunk in this narrative is now go back and now you'll see when Valentina and Philip actually come together and meet and become a couple. Then we move on to Valentina's Baby, which was a story told in 1969 and 1970. So I'm not sure what magazine this would have been in, but now we're jumping forward and backwards at the same time to where obviously Valentina and Phil are now in a relationship and they're going to be having a baby together. But the work was done earlier, 69 and 70. Love, love, love this composition here. Really, really interesting thing where we're seeing this from the top, and then each one of these views are exactly what you would see if you were down grounded and looking at the bed from the different sides. I don't think I've ever seen anyone else do this, but you could almost cut these out and like make a little box out of it where you could be looking through, you know, if these were facing out, you could look through the characters. And I know in one of the kind of introductions that I glanced through, it looks like Crepa really liked to make his own board games. So I know he liked doing these little cut and paste things, and that seems to influence it. And this is like the only other artist I can think of that's doing something like this is Chris Ware. You know, this is in '69. You don't get Chris Ware doing that till the '90s. So a real innovator, all throughout. This story has some fantasy sequences that reference earlier Valentina stories. Like here, we get Mariana the robot, who is from an earlier story where there's a robot that tries to take over Valentina's identity. Mixed in these compositions as well, something that took me a while to get used to is if it's got these rounded borders, this is in a dream, and if it's got a square border, it's in the real world. So what's going on with the light in the dream is being influenced by the light in the real world. That can make the stories a little bit confusing at first because it seems like the story just goes off in a weird direction, but actually what's happening is you're like, oh, I'm in a character's dream. Oftentimes, too, you won't see that they're dreaming until after the dream is over. So when these get mixed in, it's easy to miss that if you're not paying attention to this language that Crepa has created that his readers would have obviously been very familiar with by this time. But that's always an interesting strategy he's using in his stories. The story Valentina's baby is centered around a shoe that Philip and Valentina have found, and they're coming up with these stories for what might have happened to the shoe. So when you get these dotted borders, this is them telling stories to each other. Now we're getting Philip's kind of speculation about what might have happened, and then this is another chance for Craypaw to shout out some of the strips that he really liked, where they're telling like this detective murder mystery, and so he flips over into the 4-panel strip format and does a Chester Gould, Dick Tracy style. Just, I mean, yeah, this is why if you're gonna buy one book, this is the one that I would say if you're only going to get one of these. It's just got so much of this kind of stuff in it that I think people will enjoy, whether they really are invested in the characters or not. But I would recommend at least these first 4 volumes. I don't know about the later ones. We'll see. Here we start to get into some of Craypaw's weirder compositional experiments. In this, it works all right because he really is leading you through with the arrows. I've never liked arrows in the comics, but he's showing, and this panel gets extra weird where it's like you can kind of just go back and forth between these two, but then there's no arrows implying that the circle can go this way as well. So there's some things like this that he's trying that I think are failures, but he's having so much fun that it's really easy to get just kind of caught up in the fun and the play that he's having. But trying things like this seem, I don't know, kind of unnecessary to me. And at the end of this story, you get Valentina having her boy Mattia for the first time. You get another one of these pages that's really about subdivisions and these slow movements of time. He really likes having these slow moment to moment kind of expression panels with Valentina, and then having the hair color black kind of creates these like little rhythmic movements as well, where there's a musical like flow of like the sound going up and down or something like that. Even having the lamp in there, those are just some really really nice things. Then we get a manuscript found in the stroller, which brings back the action aspect to things, where someone hides an important manuscript in Valentina's new baby's stroller, and then there's some chase scenes and stuff like that. By the end of that story, you get this really interesting composition here, where what has happened is this manuscript that's in the stroller is a manuscript for a Russian comic that's got smuggled out of the Soviet Union, and they're trying to print it, and they hid it in Valentina's stroller, and then she goes home and does her laundry with it, and somehow that like stamps the comics onto all these different pieces of laundry. So here you have this really strange, interesting composition where comics are being chopped up on these pieces of clothes, and Philip has been sitting there trying to put the clothes back together to figure out what the manuscript is. So just a reason to try something visually different with like how comics can exist in the world, and putting that on a page, which leads to a really interesting composition. This is a 1973 work called Fallen Angels. This brings back some of the subterranean stuff from earlier in the Valentina works, where she is like the Mother Mary figure for this species of subterranean people that Philip Rembrandt is half subterranean. This to me creates a kind of reading order nightmare. I'm pretty sure that the work should be read like this, like just the flow of it. But then this here suggests that you go up here, so maybe you read to here and then up, and then he'll do this sometimes too, where you'll have to like read this way. But I think it goes, I don't know, like this and then over to there. But there is a really cool visual formalism where he has one, and I think this is probably why he has this tortured page layout. He probably could have just chosen his spots a little bit better. But he has this one figure in 3 stages of undress being broken up by the 3 panels. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And then he even has her hand kind of coming over here, even though it's this hand reaching across. It kind of looks like it could be a completion of this arm here. So really interesting visual thing, but making some tortured page layouts. I get the sense that he might have tried to never repeat a layout too, and that could have been what's... I haven't gone through and confirmed that, but I get the sense that every time I look at a page, it's a new type of composition. So there's a certain point where you just can't do much more other than bad storytelling at that point. Then in this story, The Empress's New Clothes, you get one of these big meta insertions of the author. So this is 1973. Valentina's walking around saying, "There's nothing drawn here. What's going on?" And she kicks over the signature that's always on every one of his stories. Oh, his little trademark that he never forgets. And she squashes it. And then she, falls through the page and interacts with a bottle of ink. And that's where I was saying him setting up her having that really early childhood fantasy of being dipped in the ink, sets up these later things where you could see this as him entering into the story, or you can read this just as Valentina having one of her typical fantasy episodes or her psychotic episodes dealing with her trauma, and she's imagining a creator, this Dr. Crepa guy, and this artist that she's aware she's a character in a cartoon. So a really fun, like complex way to play with the fourth wall break, where you can choose to accept it as a fourth wall break, or you can choose to accept it as a delusion. Then we take a big jump to a story that spans 1980 and 1981. This is called Lazzarate Venice, and I think this one is just a biography of Guido Crepa. There's a sequence at the beginning where Valentina and Philip are walking by and they talk to a kid, and then you just jump to this kid's life, and he's being called Guido all throughout. And again, you're obviously looking at the themes of like fascism and Catholicism, and here's some really beautiful textural work all throughout. It looks like he's maybe using razors in spots, sponges, maybe coloring with the pencil and translating to black. I'm not sure, but some really cool compositions throughout here. And then you have here the image of young Guido, talking about the Invisible Man, like, and he's drawing his own adaptation of the Invisible Man, and then he's saying that's even better than the Mummy. I draw the story of the Phantom, and then he's saying, oh, it'd be cool to do like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde one next. I'd have to get the book 3 back out to see if that's what came out next. But I think he might be setting up the fact that the next project he was going to do was his Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde adaptation. But I don't know. I'd have to look at the dates on that. So I think that's a pretty interesting thing where, again, he's kind of baking his own comics work into the comics that he's making in a clever way. We have another story here, Pietro Giacomo Ruggieri. This is a much more down-to-earth one, less of the kind of surreal, supernatural things that are in a lot of the other work. I particularly like this little sequence at the top. Again, the rhythmic stuff. This is Valentina driving from one place to the other. It reminds me of some of the scenes. I forget if it's Snatch or Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, but the Guy Ritchie sequences where he'll kind of repeat a guy drinking and sitting down, getting on a plane, going back. It has that real, we'll cover a lot of space in a short amount of time. So another just really interesting, playful visual. A lot of these stories at the later part of this book, without the surreal stuff and the supernatural stuff going on, just a little more straightforward mystery. They're also, I think, just a little bit visually tamer. The compositions are still really interesting throughout, but they're not quite as bombastic as the earlier stuff. This one's mostly just about this violin that she's been asked to take a photograph and then gets stolen because it's a master's violin. Then we get the story called Anthropology, which is a big exploration of, her and her child out on a beach, but then also her and Rembrandt rediscovering the subterraneans and Rembrandt being accosted by them. This includes sequences where Valentina is having this imaginary affair with Corto Maltese, and there's a mention here in the story itself in another piece, the last piece in the book, that this was something planned by Crepa and Hugo Pratt, where Valentina showed up in a Corto Maltese story, maybe was the suggestion, and then Corto Maltese showed up in this story. So that's fun. She's just kind of imagining having an affair with a sailor in this. But the end of this story reintroduces these subterraneans, and Valentina finds Philip has been going back and basically being raped by the subterraneans. I don't know where the rest of that story is going. Maybe that's in a volume I haven't read yet. But some really interesting textural stuff going on in the artwork with all these underwater caves, a lot of this like cool coral textures, and then a lot of what looks like dry brush or razor work to me. Definitely razors scraping over top of things. So he has not yet abandoned the brush in this art, and I think that's a good thing for Crépeau. There's some stories where it seems like he's abandoned the brush, and I think that's a detriment to his work. And then we end with the story that the book is titled after, Private Life, and this, I believe, again, has to do with Crépeau trying to catch people up as the character goes into a new magazine. This is split into two chunks. One's in 1975 and then the other's in 1985. But it's basically another timeline of Valentina. So she's going through, this is another fourth wall break where someone's talking to her from outside and saying like, hey, can you go back and comment on how you felt about all these things you've been through? And so you get these where they'll have each story. This is the Baba Yaga Bluebeard story from, and it's set in 1971. Because Valentina also ages in real time. So when we're referencing 71, this is saying this happened to her in 1971. This, absolutely love, again, the rhythmic stuff and the strange compositions going on here. And for the most part can be read pretty straightforward, but he'll do things like this that are a little bit strange. Really cool page compositions, and I think a really cool way of again, catching people up or creating a map of the whole character is to have the character themselves go back and comment on, oh, all of these big events that happened in my life. And within this Private Life, you get a jump then to 1984, 1985 artwork being done. And these are referencing some stories that I haven't read yet. Like this one in the Metro looks really cool. I really want to see this. Another one where now he's talking about his contemporaries that he admires, I'm assuming, where you have Munoz and Sampaio's Alack Sinner. You have Moebius's The Major here. And I'm not sure who this character is. They're saying Babo, but I don't know. This is a character that I'm unfamiliar with. And then on the next page, so that was a story that happened in 1975. This artwork's being done in 1984. So then in this recap, he uses this recap format to shout out people who have become popular since 1975, 9 years later. He's shouting out the Andrea Pasolini Zanardi. He's got Ragnaroks by Liberatori, and then another one that I don't know, but it's an artist named Altan. I don't know this character here. So that's a really fun mechanism too, where it's like he is keeping up on what's going on. So while he's couching in, this is a thing I did do, he's expanding that to the current times as well. So all throughout, this is going from 65 to 84, 85, 84. Being formally playful all along, being inventive all the way along, and really smart about how he's couching all these like levels of interpretation within each other, so a reader can kind of make up their own mind about what they want to assume about this. Is Valentina Crépeau? Is Crépeau her creator as a meta insertion? Is he just a fantasy within her life that's totally unrelated? Relating it to a real world actress. There's just all this interesting stuff going on. So this definitely, I think, solidifies for me how, even though there's a lot of, in my mind, like unnecessary imagery and the eroticism sometimes, really kind of brutal, uncomfortable imagery, these stories are justified as being very, very sophisticated. They're not just like pure smut. So the Valentina stuff is really, really interesting to me. I'm curious to see as the later volumes get into his other works, if I continue to like it so much, because like his adaptations and stuff I haven't been as excited about, and I haven't seen them as being as formally playful. So I'll be curious to see if that sense of play carries into everything else, or if that was just a Valentina thing. But this is by far my recommendation. If you've only got money to get one of these collected Craypaw books, the volume for The Private Life is probably the one for you. The Eisner nominated The Strange Death of Alex Raymond by Dave Sim and myself. This is a gorgeously illustrated and designed book. Dave doing most of the illustration. Amazing compositions throughout. What Dave is doing is he's recording his obsession with the death of master cartoonist Alex Raymond behind the wheel of Stan Drake's car when they got into a car crash. The best description of the book that I've heard is that it's like understanding comics with pages like this, mixed with something like From Hell, when you get into the theories about what actually happened with the car crash. And then with Sean on production, it's just one of the most gorgeously printed books you could get a hold of.